Karansebes is one of the most haunting moments in military history, a catastrophe where confusion, panic, and darkness transformed 100,000 Austrian soldiers into their own executioners. No enemy fired a shot. No Ottoman blade drew blood. Yet by dawn on September 22nd, 1788, over 10,000 imperial troops lay dead or wounded, victims of the deadliest force in warfare, fear itself. In this episode, we uncover how a single drunken misunderstanding unleashed a cascade of terror that turned brothers in arms into phantoms in the night and an army into its own nightmare. The year is 1788. Europe simmers with war. Emperor Joseph II of Austria has joined forces with Catherine the Great of Russia, launching a coordinated assault against the Ottoman Empire in what history will remember as the Russo-Turkish War. After decades of Ottoman decline, Vienna senses opportunity, a chance to push the Sultan's forces back across the Danube, to reclaim territories lost in previous centuries, to secure the vulnerable southern frontier of the Habsburg domains. Joseph II himself takes personal command, marching at the head of a massive imperial army through the Banat region, today part of Romania. His objective: drive southeast toward the fortress of Mahadia, engage Ottoman forces, and establish Austrian dominance in the region. The roads are long. Supply lines stretch thin. The multinational composition of his army, Austrians, Hungarians, Croats, Serbs, Italians, Czechs, Poles, creates a Tower of Babel where German, Hungarian, Serbian, Croatian, Italian, and half a dozen other languages collide in the camps each night. But numbers bring confidence. 100,000 soldiers march under the black and yellow banners of the Habsburgs. Surely such a force cannot fail. By mid-September, the army reaches the town of Karansebes on the Timis River. Intelligence reports suggest Ottoman forces are near, perhaps a day's march away. Joseph II orders the army to make camp on the western bank, while cavalry scouts probe eastward across the river to locate the enemy. The evening of September 21st descends with an uneasy quiet. Soldiers prepare meals, tend horses, clean muskets. Officers huddle over maps by candlelight. No one realizes they are hours away from a disaster that will become a dark legend whispered in military academies for centuries, a cautionary tale of what happens when the fog of war descends not on the battlefield, but within an army's own mind. This was far more than a military catastrophe. Karansebes represents a turning point in understanding the psychology of warfare itself. Here, courage, discipline, communication breakdown, and primal terror collided in a perfect storm of human vulnerability. The Battle of Karansebes, if we can even call it a battle, exposes a terrifying truth that an army's greatest enemy is often itself. Losing this army meant losing the entire campaign, humiliating the emperor, and exposing the southern territories to Ottoman raids. But more than that, it revealed the fragility of order, the thinness of the line between civilization and chaos, and the devastating power of fear to override reason, training, and loyalty. In a single night, the most fundamental assumption of warfare, that you can identify your enemy, would be shattered. On one side stood the Imperial Austrian Army, approximately 100,000 soldiers representing the multinational Habsburg Empire. This was no homogeneous force. German-speaking infantry from Austria proper formed the backbone. Hungarian hussars, legendary cavalry renowned across Europe, provided reconnaissance and shock troops. Croatian border regiments, hardened frontier fighters who had spent generations battling Ottoman raiders, brought ferocity and local knowledge. Italian artillerists manned the cannons. Serbian militias, recruited from Orthodox Christian communities eager to strike back at their former Ottoman overlords, added irregular forces. Czech and Polish contingents rounded out this polyglot military machine. The command structure relied on German, the language of officers and official orders. But in the ranks, chaos ruled. A Hungarian cavalryman might not understand a Croatian sergeant. An Italian gunner couldn't communicate with a Serbian militiaman. This linguistic fragmentation created invisible fault lines, cracks that under pressure could, and would, explode into catastrophe. The army was well equipped, properly supplied, and numerically overwhelming. But it carried a fatal flaw. It couldn't talk to itself. Against them, somewhere in the darkness to the east, lurked Ottoman forces. Exact numbers remain uncertain. Contemporary estimates range from 30,000 to 60,000 Turkish soldiers. But here is a horrifying truth. On the night of September 21st, 1788, no Ottoman soldier came anywhere near Karansebes. The enemy existed only in the imagination, a phantom born of rumor, alcohol, and darkness. The Ottomans were real, yes, and dangerous, but they were miles away, unaware that their enemy was about to commit suicide. The Austrian army's only advantages were numbers, equipment, and training. But they had weaknesses that would prove lethal: No unified language, no clear chain of command in crisis, no way to verify information rapidly across 100,000 panicked souls, and, critically, no defense against their own imagination. As dusk settled on September 21st, a contingent of Austrian hussars, Hungarian cavalry scouts, crossed the Timis River on reconnaissance. Their mission, probe forward, locate Ottoman positions, return with intelligence. These were experienced soldiers, comfortable in hostile territory, trained to gather information and avoid engagement. But they were also men far from home, tired from weeks of marching, and opportunistic. In a small village on the eastern bank, the hussars discovered something more immediately appealing than military intelligence: barrels of schnapps. Locals, anticipating either army's arrival, had abandoned stores of alcohol. The hussars, seeing no immediate danger and feeling they'd earned a reward, began drinking. What started as a few swigs became a full-fledged bacchanal. Hungarian cavalrymen, their reconnaissance forgotten, set up an impromptu tavern in the village square, selling schnapps to each other, laughing, singing, celebrating a victory that hadn't happened. Word spread. Other soldiers, perhaps infantry who'd crossed the river out of curiosity, perhaps camp followers, perhaps other scouts, arrived at the village. Soon a raucous party erupted on the wrong side of the river, directly in what should have been enemy territory. No one thought to maintain discipline. No one posted sentries. The alcohol flowed. Then other Austrian soldiers arrived. These newcomers, possibly Serbian or Croatian infantry, also wanted schnapps. The drunk hussars, having claimed the barrels as their prize, refused to share. What began as negotiation escalated into argument. The argument grew heated. In the babel of languages, Hungarian, Serbian, Croatian, German, insults were hurled, probably misunderstood, definitely taken personally. Someone drew a weapon. Someone fired a shot into the air, or at the ground, or perhaps at another soldier. Chaos erupted. In the confusion, someone screamed a word that would doom thousands. Terci. Turks. In the darkness, in the linguistic confusion, in the alcohol-fueled panic, that single word ignited terror. The drunk and the sober alike heard Terci, and the meaning was universal. The enemy. The Ottomans. Here. Now. Attacking. The hussars, the infantry, everyone in the village panicked. They abandoned the schnapps and ran back toward the river, back toward the main camp, screaming warnings. Terci. Terci. The Turks are coming. The Turks are attacking. They scrambled across the Timis, stumbling through shallow water, gasping, wild-eyed, spreading the alarm. The main Austrian camp, sprawled across the western bank, sat in twilight calm. Cook fires glowed. Soldiers told stories, mended equipment, settled in for the night. Then out of the darkness came panicked figures, cavalry, infantry, all screaming Terci. Officers demanded clarification. What's happening? Where are the Turks? How many? But the fleeing soldiers couldn't provide coherent answers. Language barriers made communication impossible. A Hungarian hussar's frantic warning was incomprehensible to a German officer. A Serbian soldier's shout meant nothing to an Italian artilleryman. All anyone could grasp was the tone. Terror. Pure, unfiltered terror. And terror is contagious. Within minutes, panic radiated through the camp like ripples from a stone thrown into black water. Soldiers grabbed weapons. Officers shouted contradictory orders in different languages. No one knew what was happening. No one could see anything clearly. Darkness had fully fallen. Cook fires created pools of light surrounded by deeper shadows. Any movement in those shadows could be friend or foe. Every silhouette became potentially Ottoman. The human mind, evolved to detect threats, began seeing enemies everywhere. A running figure, friend fleeing or Turk attacking. A shout in an unfamiliar language, comrade calling for help or enemy battle cry. In the absence of information, fear filled the void. Then someone fired a shot. Maybe at a real person. Maybe at a shadow. Maybe into the air out of sheer panic. That single shot was a spark in the powder magazine. Across the camp, other soldiers heard gunfire and assumed the worst. The Ottomans are here. They opened fire. At what? At anything moving. At shadows. At sounds. At other Austrian soldiers. In the darkness, identification was impossible. A Croatian soldier heard Serbian and thought it was Turkish. An Austrian officer heard Hungarian and mistook it for an enemy language. The Italian artillerists heard shouting from multiple directions and assumed they were surrounded. Everyone was shooting. No one knew what they were shooting at. The deadliest friendly fire incident in military history had begun. Officers tried to restore order. They screamed commands in German. Halt! Ceasefire! Hold your positions. But their voices were drowned in the cacophony of musket fire, screams, panic-driven curses in a dozen languages. Some officers tried to rally their units. A few succeeded temporarily, forming small islands of discipline in the sea of chaos. But these islands couldn't communicate with each other. A disciplined Austrian company, seeing another disciplined Hungarian company approaching from the darkness, had no way to identify them. Were they friends regrouping? Or Ottomans in Habsburg uniforms, a common ruse? Without passwords, without clear sightlines, without any way to verify identity, the default became fire first. The Austrian cavalry, thousands of horses, panicked. Musket fire, screaming, the smell of gunpowder, the chaos, all triggered the animal's flight instinct. Horses bolted, trampling soldiers, smashing through tent lines, dragging equipment. Riders who tried to control their mounts found themselves carried into the heart of the chaos. Some cavalrymen, convinced they were charging Ottoman positions, actually charged their own infantry lines. The infantry, seeing cavalry thundering toward them from darkness, fired volleys. Hungarian hussars, the very soldiers whose drunken brawl started the catastrophe, died under Austrian musket fire. The cavalry's stampede intensified the panic. Soldiers, dove aside, were trampled, fired blindly at horses and riders. The camp descended into hell. In this detailed nightmare, we break down the cascade of failures that transformed order into annihilation. How linguistic diversity became a fatal vulnerability, German commands meaningless to Serbian militias, Hungarian shouts interpreted as Turkish by Croatian regiments, Italian artillerists unable to coordinate with anyone, creating isolated units fighting private battles against phantoms. How darkness weaponized fear. The human eye, useless beyond 20 paces in night combat, transformed every moving shadow into an Ottoman soldier, every voice into an enemy cry, every friendly soldier into a potential threat. How the fog of war concentrated within a single army. Instead of uncertainty about enemy positions, Austrian soldiers faced total uncertainty about everything. Who was friend? Who was foe? Where safety lay? Whether retreat meant salvation or running deeper into danger. How panic spread through social proof. When soldiers or comrades fleeing, evolutionary instinct overrode training. It experienced warriors run. There must be mortal danger. Better to flee than stay and discover you were wrong. How the absence of central command created anarchy. Emperor Joseph II was not in immediate control of the camp. Field commanders couldn't communicate. Junior officers made independent decisions based on incomplete information, creating 100 separate battles. The decisive psychological moment. The tipping point when enough soldiers believed the Ottomans were present that disbelief became impossible. Once critical mass of panic was reached, no evidence of the contrary could penetrate the collective delusion. The battle raged for hours. From approximately 9 p.m. until well past midnight, the Austrian army fought itself. Musket volleys echoed across the Banat countryside. The flashes of gunfire lit the darkness like lightning. Soldiers fired, reloaded, fired again at targets they never saw clearly. Some units maintained enough discipline to form defensive squares, the traditional protection against cavalry charges. But the cavalry attacking them wore Austrian uniforms. Some soldiers, realizing the truth, tried to stop the madness. They waved Habsburg banners, shouted Freund, friend, in German, tried to physically interpose themselves between firing lines. Many of these peacemakers died, shot by their own comrades who mistook their intervention for an Ottoman trick. As midnight passed, exhaustion began to slow the carnage. Ammunition ran low. Soldiers collapsed from fear, fatigue, wounds. The initial panic's energy burned itself out. Gradually, pockets of calm emerged. Officers managed to convince their immediate surroundings that no Ottomans were present. Slowly, agonizingly, the truth percolated through the shattered army. They had been fighting themselves. The realization brought not relief but horror. Men looked at the bodies around them, bodies in Habsburg uniforms, faces they recognized, and understood what they had done. Some soldiers went mad on the spot. Others wept. Many simply sat in shock, unable to process the nightmare. Dawn rose on September 22, 1788. The Austrian camp resembled a battlefield after a catastrophic defeat. Bodies sprawled everywhere. The wounded screamed for help. Equipment lay shattered. Horses wandered riderless. Tents burned. Cannon had been fired at point-blank range into Habsburg formations. Emperor Joseph II, returning to camp after spending the night away from the main force, rode into devastation. His aides briefed him on the incomprehensible truth. The army had destroyed itself. No Ottoman soldier had come within miles of Karansebes. The emperor surveyed the carnage in disbelief. Historical records show that he initially refused to accept the reports, certain that some Ottoman force must have been present. But investigation confirmed the impossible. His army had inflicted this upon itself. The casualty estimates vary, but contemporary accounts and military records suggest over 10,000 Austrian soldiers were killed or wounded at Karansebes. Some sources claim the number reached as high as 15,000. Thousands more deserted in the chaos, fleeing into the countryside, abandoning the army entirely. Equipment losses were staggering, artillery pieces destroyed or abandoned, supply wagons burned, munitions expended against phantoms. The Austrian army's combat effectiveness was shattered. Even soldiers physically unharmed suffered psychological trauma. How could you trust your comrades after this? How could officers command soldiers who might panic and turn their weapons on each other at the first sign of stress? The Ottomans arrived at Karansebes 2 days later. Their scouts, expecting resistance, instead found an abandoned camp littered with Austrian dead. They captured the town without firing a shot. Ottoman commanders, surveying the scene, struggled to understand what had happened. Had disease struck? Had internal mutiny erupted? The truth, that the Austrian army had annihilated itself through panic, was so absurd that Ottoman reports initially didn't believe their own scouts. When the full story emerged, it spread through the Ottoman ranks and beyond, becoming a propaganda victory. The mighty Habsburg army, feared across Europe, had been defeated by darkness and its own terror. No Ottoman valor needed, no brilliant strategy required. The enemy had obliged by destroying itself. The strategic consequences rippled across the war. Emperor Joseph II's campaign stalled. The loss of 10,000 soldiers and the shattered morale of survivors forced a retreat. Austrian ambitions in the Banat evaporated. The Ottomans, handed an unexpected reprieve, reinforced their positions and stabilized the front. What should have been a decisive Austrian advance became a humiliating withdrawal. The Russo-Turkish War would continue until 1792, but Austria's role diminished significantly. Vienna, embarrassed by Karansebes, became far more cautious. The disaster tarnished Emperor Joseph II's reputation. He had styled himself an enlightened reformer and military leader. Now he was the emperor whose army had committed suicide. The psychological wound to Habsburg prestige never fully healed. But the legacy of Karansebes extends far beyond one campaign. Military academies study it as the ultimate cautionary tale of command and control failure. It demonstrates how language barriers in multinational forces require extraordinary attention to communication protocols. It shows how the fog of war can descend not between armies but within a single force. It reveals the terrifying speed with which order can collapse into chaos when fear takes command. Modern military doctrine on friendly fire prevention, on clear identification systems, on the importance of reliable battlefield communication, all trace intellectual lineage back to lessons written in Austrian blood at Karansebes. The Battle of Karansebes is more than a bizarre military accident. It is a symbol of humanity's vulnerability to our own worst instincts. It shows how fear, once unleashed, overrides reason, training, and even self-preservation. How the absence of clear communication transforms allies into threats. How darkness, literal and metaphorical, creates monsters where none exist. The Austrian soldiers at Karansebes were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They were human beings thrust into a situation where every evolved survival instinct betrayed them, where the very diversity meant to be strength became fatal weakness, where the fog of war condensed into choking blindness. Karansebes echoes across military history as a haunting reminder that the enemy is not always across the battlefield. Sometimes the enemy is panic. Sometimes it's miscommunication. Sometimes it's a darkness within, the primal terror that lurks beneath civilization's thin veneer, waiting for the right circumstances to erupt. Even today, military forces spend enormous resources on identification systems, communication protocols, and psychological preparation precisely because Karansebes showed what happens when these systems fail. Every IFF transponder, every radio protocol, every night vision device exists in part because 10,000 Austrian soldiers died fighting ghosts in the dark. This catastrophe was far more than a military disaster. It was a revelation of the human condition, proof that our greatest battles are often against ourselves. It shows that discipline, courage, and overwhelming force mean nothing when fear seizes control and transforms brothers into phantoms, comrades into executioners, and an army into its own apocalypse. Step into the darkness. Witness the panic. Relive the night an empire's army became its own enemy. Welcome to our channel where history comes alive.